Okay, Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. This is Tuesday, the 28th of December, 2020, and I'm going to talk today about uh, Douglas Southall Freedman's assessment of Robert E. Lee as a military commander. This will be, he has about 22 pages in chapter 11 of his fourth volume of his four-volume biography of General Lee. And what I've done is I've excerpted it and edited it, and I'm going to read it aloud to you. It's going to be about 2,000 words, whereas the whole chapter runs about 22 pages. I do think many of you were, if you're interested in what I'm going to be reading to you, you're going to want to read the whole chapter. And but before we get there, let's get started with first, what you want to do is you want to click on the notification bell in the upper right, outside of this picture where I am, but go into the YouTube frame, find that notification bell in the upper right, click on that, and you'll be notified whenever I have a new episode of Civil War Chat. Secondly, to learn more about Robert E. Lee, I bring your attention to my book, The Confederacy at Flood Tide, which is about the opportunity for the Confederacy to have won independence from June 1862 to December of 1862. It covers political developments, military developments in Eastern, Western, and Trans-Mississippi territories. It also analyzes espionage developments and the diplomatic situation as it changed across the Atlantic. So now, if you want to buy this book, which I recommend that you do, you can get it on Amazon for, I think it's $28 there, and you won't get a signature there, but you can buy the book. And if you want a signed copy by me, you can get one by emailing me at Phil_Leigh, Leigh at me.com. Phil would be PHIL and then _LEIGH at me.com. I will sell it to you for $31 with a signature, an autograph book, and I will pay for the postage here in the United States, but not if your shipment goes elsewhere. Also, use that email address if you want to get access, a link to Douglas Southall Freeman's entire four-volume biography of Robert E. Lee. It is available online. Chapter 11 from the fourth volume is what I'm going to be reading from. I'm going to be reading excerpts, edited excerpts that make the point. I think Freeman, you'll see, I think, why people praise Freeman's biography of Lee. But, I'll just let you decide for yourself. I'm going to just read the excerpts. Again, it's about 2,000 words. So let's go ahead and get started. Had Lee's sense of duty held him to the Union as it held Winfield Scott and George Thomas, how much easier his course could have been. Never then, after the first mobilization, would he have lacked for troops or been compelled to count the cost of any move. He would not have agonized over men who shivered in their nakedness or dyed the road with their shoeless, bleeding feet. Well clad they would have been, and well fed too. They would not have been brought down to the uncertain ration of a pint of meal and a quarter of a pound of Nassau bacon. The superior artillery would have been his, not his adversaries. On his order, new locomotives and stout cars could have rolled to the front swiftly to carry his army where the feeble engines and the groaning trains of the Confederacy could not deliver them in. He would have enjoyed the command of the sea so that he could have advanced his base 100 miles or 200 without the anguish of a single choking march. If one jaded horse succumbed on a raid, the teeming prairies would have supplied two. He would, in all human probability, have won the war between the states. But after the manner of the Lees, he held unhesitatingly to the older allegiance and had found it the way of difficulty. Always the odds had been against him. 3-2 in this campaign, 2-1 in that. Not once in a major engagement had he met the Federals on even terms. Not once after a victory had his army been strong enough to follow it up. To extemporize when time was against him, to improvise when supplies failed him, to reorganize when death claimed his best lieutenants, that had been his constant lot. From the moment he undertook to mobilize Virginia until the last volley rolled across the red hills of Appomattox, there had been no single day when he had enjoyed an advantage he had not won with the blood of men he could not replace. His guns had been as much outranged as his men had been outnumbered. He had marched as often to find food as to confound his foe. His transportation had progressively declined as his dependence on it had increased. The revolutionary government that he espoused in 1861 had been created as a protest against an alleged violation of the rights of the states. When it required an executive dictatorship to live, it chose to die by constitutionalism. Fighting in the apex of the triangle, one side of which was constantly exposed to naval attack by an enemy that had controlled the waterways, he had been forced from the first to accept a dispersion of forces that weakened his front without protecting his communications. Always within this exposed territory, his prime mission had been that of defending a capital close to the frontier. With poverty, he had faced abundance. He believed that the general in chief should strive to bring his troops together at the right time and place, and that he should leave combat to the generals of brigade and division. To this theory, Lee steadfastly held from his opening campaign through the Battle of the Wilderness. It was for this reason that he deferred to Longstreet at Second Manassas and did not himself direct the attacks of the Confederate right on the July 2nd and 3rd at Gettysburg. Who may say whether, when his campaigns are viewed as a whole, adherence to this theory of function cost the Army more than it won for the South? If this policy failed with Longstreet, it was gloriously successful with Jackson. If the failure at Gettysburg was partly chargeable to it, the victory at Chancellorsville was in large measure the result of its application. In sum, the balance to the credit of his generalship is clear and absolute. In 3 fast-moving months, he mobilized Virginia and so secured her defenses that the war had been in progress a year before the Unionists were within 50 miles of Richmond. Finding the Federals when he took command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1st, 1862, almost under the shadow of the city steeple, he saved the capital from almost certain capture and the Confederate cause from probable collapse. He repulsed 4 major offensives against Richmond, and by his invasion of Pennsylvania, he delayed the 5th for 10 months. Ere the Federals were back on the Richmond line again, 2 years to the day from the time he had succeeded Johnston, Lee had fought 10 major battles: Gaines Mills, Frazier's Farm, Malvern Hill, Second Manassas, Sharpsburg, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. 6 of these he had indisputably won. At Frazier's Farm, he had gained the field, but had not enveloped the enemy as he had planned. Success had not been his at Malvern Hill and at Sharpsburg, but only at Gettysburg had he met with definite defeat, and even there, he clouded the title of his adversary to a clear-cut victory. During the 24 months when he had been free to employ open maneuver, a period that had ended with Cold Harbor, he had sustained approximately 103,000 casualties and had inflicted 145,000. Holding, as he usually had, to the offensive, his combat losses had been greater in proportion to his numbers than those of the Federals, but he had demonstrated how strategy may increase an opponent's casualties, for his losses included only 16,000 prisoners, whereas he had taken 38,000. Chained at length to the Richmond defenses, he had saved the capital from capture for 10 months. All this he had done in the face of repeated defeats for the Southern troops in nearly every other part of the Confederacy. Lee is to be judged, in fact, not merely by what he accomplished with his own troops, but by what he prevented the hosts of the Union from doing sooner in the other theaters elsewhere. Lee was preeminently a strategist, and a strategist because he was a sound military logician. It was well it is well enough to speak of his splendid presence on the field of battle, his poise, his cheer, his manner with his men, but essentially he was an intellect with a developed aptitude for the difficult synthesis of war. The incidental never obscured the fundamental. The trivial never distracted. He had the ability to visualize his fundamental problem as though it had been worked out in a model and set before his eyes. Once his problem was thus made graphic, he projected himself mentally across the enemy lines to a position of his adversary. What was the logical thing for his opponent to do? Assuming that the Federals had intelligent leadership, he said, quote, "It is proper for us to expect the enemy to do what he ought to do," close quote. After he had studied the probabilities, he would turn to his intelligence reports, prisoner statements, captured correspondence, newspapers, information from his spies, dispatches from the cavalry outpost. All of these he studied carefully and often at first hand. In assembling this information, he was not more adept than many other capable generals, and in studying it, he was not more diligent, but in interpreting it, he excelled. Always critical of the news that came from the spies, few of whom he trusted, he was cautious in accepting newspaper reports until he learned which correspondents were closed-mouthed or ill-informed, and which were reckless or well furnished with fact. When he discovered that the representative of the Philadelphia Inquirer, for example, knew what he reported and reported what he knew, Lee attached high importance to that newspaperman's statements. A credulous outpost commander received scant attention when he forwarded countryside rumor, but Stuart's sixth sense Lee soon learned to appreciate. And when that tireless offer affirmed that the enemy was marching toward an objective he named, Lee rarely questioned it. The infantry were apt to move quickly in the hoof prints made by Lee's returning courier. Made by Stuart's returning courier. If Lee's strategy was built in large part on his interpretation of his intelligence reports, that interpretation was facilitated more by Stuart and Stuart's scouts than by anything else. Dealing with 4 secretaries of war in order, Walker, Benjamin, Seddon, and Breckinridge, Lee encountered little or no friction. To each of the secretaries, Lee reported, and both each of them he laid his difficulties, and before each of them he laid his difficulties. Usually he was candid with them as to his plans, so much so indeed that often if a letter were not addressed to the Honorable Secretary of War, one would think it was intended for the confidence of the President Davis. Only when important moves were afoot and secrecy was imperative was Lee ever restrained in addressing the War Office. No commander ever put a higher valuation on the innate qualities of leadership. Quote, "I cannot trust a man to control others who cannot control himself, he said. The personal cowardice, for personal cowardice, he had a soldierly scorn, but he rarely encountered it. There was only one brigadier general in his army, and none above that grade, concerning whose personal courage in the presence of the enemy there was ever a serious question, except perhaps in the case of Longstreet. The more a soldier was capable of doing, the more Lee demanded of him. Although he realized that a trained and disciplined officers' corps was the greatest need of the Army, he was almost alone among the higher commanders of the Confederacy in realizing that the volunteer leaders of a revolutionary force could not be given the stern, impersonal treatment that had been meted out to the professional soldiers of an established government. He knew how to deal with volunteer soldiers. How different might have been the fate of General Braxton Bragg and perhaps of the Confederacy if that officer, Bragg, had learned this lesson from Lee. All that can be said of Lee's dealings with his officers as one of the reasons for his success can be said in even warmer tones of his relations with the men in the ranks. They were his chief pride, his first obligation. Their distress was his deepest concern, their well-being his constant aim. His manner with them was said to be his lieutenants to be perfect. His manner with those soldiers was said by his lieutenants to be perfect. Never ostentatious or consciously dramatic. His bearing, his record of victories, his manifest interest in the individual, and his conversation with the humblest private he met in the road combined to create in the minds of his troops a reverence, a confidence, an affection that built up the morale of the army. The men came to believe that whatever he did was right, that whatever he assigned them, they could accomplish. Once that belief became fixed, the Army of Northern Virginia was well nigh invincible. There is perhaps no more impressive example in modern war of the power of a personality in creating morale. The final major reason for Lee's successes in the face of bewildering odds is akin to the two just considered. After many failures in the West, the South came to fix its faith on the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, and on its commander. Elsewhere, there was bickering and division. In Virginia, there was harmony and united resistance. The Southern people remembered that Washington had lost New York and New England, Georgia and South Carolina, and had still triumphed in the Revolutionary War. Lee, they believed, would do no less. As long as he could keep the field, the South could keep its heart. Morale behind the line, not less than on the front of the action, was sustained by Lee. The qualities that created this confidence were essentially those that assured Lee the unflagging aid of the president, the loyalty of his lieutenants, and the enthusiastic devotion of his men. I hope you found that to be inspiring. I think to me, it shows why Douglas Southall Freeman's 4-volume biography of Lee is sometimes regarded with the highest respect, because it deserves it. Even though it's 4 volumes, my gosh, I thought when I bought it, I thought I'll never read this thing. But what Freeman's writing is good, Freeman's insight is good, and each chapter is digestible. The chapter that I just read you, chapter 11, the 4th volume, and again, what I just read you were excerpts. The full chapter covers 22 pages. You can read that before you go to bed. And then the next chapter, chapter 12, similar. Freeman does that throughout. It's really it's a good technique, and I'm glad that I have seen it, because it may be the proper way to tackle anything that turns out to be a long book. So, what else can I say? Again, I do want to encourage you, if you want to get a link to the entire 4 volumes of Douglas Southall Freedman's biography of Robert E. Lee online, email me, Phil_Lee, Leigh, at me.com. Use that same email address to inquire about getting a signed copy of this book, The Confederacy at Flood Tide. It tells you a lot about how Lee became successful, and underscores a lot of the points that Douglas Freeman makes. Again, the email address is Phil, Phil _Lee, Leigh, at me.com. You can get this book at Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It's $28. If you want to get a signed copy from me, it's $31. I will pay the postage if the delivery is here in the United States. Okay, so that's it for me today. Thank you for joining me for Civil War Chat. And this is Phil Lee. Until next time, I look forward to seeing you again.